Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 4th of February 2024. Go to where we normally start, Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to the video below. And we see a downtick in a couple of these categories, still high in a few others. 810 personnel is a significant number of troops to lose in a single day. Not the highest that we've seen, not over 1,000, but still significant number there. 2 tanks is a very low number in that category. It could indicate that the Russians aren't pushing on in those large attacks that we have seen over the last few weeks pick up again. 13 armored personnel vehicles, likewise not the highest number we've seen in that category. Somewhat around the sort of average number. I can't remember the exact average, but it's not the high end of the spectrum. And 31 artillery systems, though, is a fairly decent number. So that could suggest that the Ukrainians are still going for those counter-battery activity, trying to hit Russian artillery behind the lines. Now, we're going to have a little focus on artillery for a second, because there are huge artillery losses for the Russians. And one might ask, well, when's it going to have an effect on the Russians' ability to use artillery? How many pieces of artillery do they have? I mean, surely this is nonsense. They can't just keep losing 30 pieces a day and still maintain enough artillery to attack the Ukrainians. Well, the answer is they can. And indeed, they just have massive, massive amounts of artillery in stock. We'll go on to Covert Cabal's analysis in a second. But just the other day, there was a train full of like 35 pieces of old towed artillery that were sent to the Kherson area, and then the same kind of day, there's supposedly, or around that time, there are 40 pieces reported lost in that area. I'm not saying in one day, but the idea is they're sending in a trainload of old towed artillery pieces and losing that amount. Just this constant cycling of old kit from deep stocks, deep storage, then pulled out to the front line, attrited. Pulled out to the front line, attrited. So the Ukrainians can be taking this number of artillery systems on a daily basis. It is absolutely not just plausible, but probable. And it's probable because we can see the dents in the huge stockpiles that have taken place. And those dents suggest that the Ukrainian general staff figures are somewhat correct, if not pretty correct, in their claims about the losses. But the Russians have an absolute ton of that stuff. And so it's this almost endless process of attriting down the Russian stocks. Hopefully at some point those stocks, the ones that they have to provide from deep storage are so, I don't know, deteriorated that they become less and less useful. I don't know if that happened or whether they are still usable, even some of the worst pieces. We'll see. 41 vehicles and fuel tanks is a very high number in that category as well. So we're continuing to see lots of Bukankers, SUVs, those kind of vehicles blown up, and 6 pieces of special equipment. Again, fairly high in that category. That's demining, excavators, surveillance, comms equipment, so on and so forth. So a fairly decent day for the Ukrainians in the stats there. Now, Andrew Perpetua's loss statistics show almost a parity in the stats between, in fact, there's a couple more Ukrainian losses, I think, than Russian losses there. However, he didn't complete his tossing up of the numbers. These are the losses I could have identified today. There are a lot I couldn't get to, says Andrew Perpetua, though. At least 10 more, mostly Russian tanks, and then maybe more in addition to that, but I need to go to sleep. I mean, the man is just a machine. That is to say that you can add a whole bunch of Russian tanks to that, so that would shift the figure somewhat. But nonetheless, let's have a look at what we have here. I presume that pretty much one or two bits of Russian footage dropped to show an awful lot of Ukrainian civilian vehicles being, well, at least damaged. A lot of damaged Ukrainian pickup trucks and SUVs there. That makes up the majority of the Ukrainian equipment. There are some tanks, though, 4 tanks to add to that, and old BMP-1 APC as well. 4 boats, and then we've got an excavator, engineering vehicle taken out, and a piece of comms equipment. So not incredibly high value equipment, but a consistently large number of bits of kit, including a lot of civilian vehicles. And then we go to the Russian vehicles lost. Although there are a number of civilian vehicles and trucks, we have far more tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, APCs as well. So in those tanks, well, we've got an engineering vehicle, a BAT-2 that was destroyed, got stuck in barbed wire, and was hit by the looks of it. Then we have a number of tanks abandoned and destroyed, including a T-90M abandoned due to hitting a mine, then hit by an FPV drone. So abandoned and seemingly destroyed afterwards. T-80s, T-72s, and then BMP-2s, BTRs. So I think on balance, the Russians, even though there's a couple more bits of kit lost by the Ukrainians, mainly civilian stuff, I think on balance the Russians have lost more valuable equipment by a fair bit, I guess, and a bunch more tanks and IFVs than the Ukrainians for sure. Okay, so that's what Andrew Perpetua has to say there. Now, talking about the loss stats for artillery, we have Covert Cabal doing an analysis, a breakdown of what he has found with regard to losses and what the stocks are looking like back in Russia. So, some pretty significant numbers here. Pre-war situation for towed artillery was 14,630. And those stocks are down to 6,786. So they've halved their stocks. And of course, that still means that there's 6,786 bits of towed artillery left. So they've got a good year and a half, says Covert Cabal, of being able to supply towed artillery to the front line. Self-propelled guns has gone from 4,450 to just below 3,000. Pretty challenging for the Ukrainians there. Okay, let's listen to what he has to say in conclusion.
So other than those bases, there are about 6 other bases that we looked at, but they're all very small and not worth spending time on. So the grand total, pre-war, self-propelled, there were 4,450 and towed 14,631. And now, from recent satellite imagery, it's down to 2,961 self-propelled and 6,786 towed artillery that Russia has remaining. And then finally, here's the breakdown of each type at each base. Again, unfortunately, some of the imagery is several months old, so today it's likely to have even less. But again, It's important to note that this is just storage numbers, and not counting artillery in active service. They likely have another 1,000 plus of each in active service. So, with Russia using up 1/3 of their pre-war self-propelled artillery in storage, and more than half of their towed, if they continue at that rate, they would run out of towed in just over a year and a half, and self-propelled in just 3 years and 10 months. But that's only if they keep withdrawing artillery at the same rate, and many other variables. That time they have left might be less, as they would be pulling the better condition ones first. A decent percentage of the artillery still in storage is likely in worse condition, and many beyond saving. But other factors also might increase the time they have remaining. As you can tell, their towed percentage has dropped much more than self-propelled. And on top of that, you might have noticed that Oryx has Russia losing nearly twice as many self-propelled than towed. And both these are explained for 3 reasons. First, almost 30% of the drop in towed is from mortars, which some might not consider artillery per se, but we decided to count just the large and typically towed mortars. Second, it's much more likely that Russia would scrap a towed piece of artillery to use its barrel for replacements, since self-propelled are much more valuable, and most towed have a corresponding self-propelled version that uses the same barrel. And third is that, according to military balance and Russian force structures pre-war, Russia didn't have many towed artillery active. It was pretty much all self-propelled. So for the war, and with new and more infantry-based units being created, they would have had to pull them out of storage. Once those units are created, the decline rate of towed would drop significantly as well. So towed artillery will likely last much longer than just a year and a half. And finally, I just wanted to add that we waited until after we finished counting to compare with what military balance states, so that way it wouldn't influence us. But our pre-war numbers, compared to military balance 2022, were 86% of SPGs and 88% of towed artillery in storage. But when looking at their other years, they have the same number for each since 2020. So with that, I'd say we're pretty confident that we located all the bases and got a pretty accurate count, despite all the difficulty. So Russia still has a ton of artillery left, and it's likely to last them for a few more years to come, at least.
And I think that's probably fairly fair to say. They just got a lot. I think there's probably an awful lot to say about taking their best pieces first. So, the stuff that's left will be of lower quality. So you're not quite sure whether they can use all that stuff. He talks about earlier in the video how it's very difficult with the resolution of imagery and given the width of the barrels to be able to make any judgment on indeed whether they even have barrels, a lot of these pieces, because it just doesn't show up. I think it's something like 50 centimeter barrels on 70 centimeter satellite imagery or something like that. So there are a lot of caveats. I'm not trying to be positive for Ukraine, but I would suggest that it's going to be more challenging to bring things out of storage the longer the war goes on. But it also goes to show how many pieces of artillery the Russians have to draw from. So when you see these numbers and you think, why has there not been this tipping point yet? They've lost another 31 today. When is it going to be that they're going to really start struggling with artillery? And that could well be a long time away yet. You could still have a year full of losing 31 pieces of artillery a day and still be in this same position. Right, Ukrainian HIMARS have struck a building in Lysychansk, killing 20 members of the Russian Emergency Situations Ministry. The ministry has reported. A3OB South here says Lysychansk at the moment, the number of dead Russians stands at 28 after HIMARS arrivals at the cafe where about 30 high-profile Russian military were at that moment. This could be a high-value strike. The Russians are obviously saying, civilians and this and that. But the Ukrainians aren't going to be wasting HIMARS strikes on a cafe in the middle of Lysychansk, right? This will be almost certainly a high-value strike on Russian fairly high personnel, I would have thought. Another piece from War Translated here. Russians are majorly worried about first-person view drones. Almost every influencer expressed their opinion about this issue recently, contrary to how Russia handles the production of drones, where one company took over most of the business. In Ukraine, they spread production across many small enterprises, but the chances are the Russians will catch up. It is our job as individuals to help Ukraine's keep the distance in innovation as far as possible by supporting small enterprises. I'm going to return to this in the military aid section and go through that. But just to say, there are complaints from the Russians on the lines about drones. And here there are complaints from Russians on the lines about munitions drops that are not as precise as the Ukrainian ones. I just watched one video with munitions drops from different sides. Ours are not dropping nearly as accurately as the Ukrainians. Ukrainians drop precisely into the trenches and right under the feet, but ours drop 3 to 4 meters away. Maybe there's something wrong with the plumage, or do the Ukrainians have more video material to choose from due to the large number of drops? Great point there at the end. So this could be a selection bias, but it could be easier for them to do. It could just be that the Ukrainians are dropping way more and are able to select decent ones, and so maybe like 50% of their drones are dropping accurately, and that's maybe the same for the Russians. But because the Ukrainians are dropping 5 times as more, you just get lots more accurate footage. So the Russians don't have as much accurate footage. So it either is because the Ukrainians are using drones more. There are more drones. It goes back to those production numbers and whether the Russians are accurate. So the Ukrainians could be using them more, or they are just more accurate. They are better operators, and whatever variables are at play, there may be better drones or whatever it is. But the stats are just better because something is improved in the Ukrainian usage, or both, right? But I think that's interesting. Main intelligence director at the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine informs in the Russian city of Engels, the commander of the crew of a T-295 strategic bomber, Major Oleg Stegavyov, was shot. The specified pilot of the Russian Air Force was born in 1983, served at Engels Air Base. He is directly involved in launching missile strikes on civilian objects in Ukraine and killing our people. As a result of the attack, he suffered gunshot wounds. Whether he survived or not, we will clarify. I presume that means there's been an assassination of a Tu-95 pilot inside Russia, and that's interesting, significant in terms of training capabilities there. In occupied Crimea, a major with Russia's army has been jailed. Alexander Sungarov is accused of wasting diesel fuel on an especially large scale as part of an organized group, so stealing and lining his own pockets. Despite having a state award previously, he was detained. So he's going to be taken out of the pool of seasoned professionals there. Yeah. Not too much to report in terms of drone strikes and distance strikes. Drones were evidence in the skies over Bryansk in Russia last night. Don't know of any outcome there. I mean, flashes in the sky, so something has happened, an explosion somewhere. Somebody here saying, Ewan McDonald reporting on some OSINT work determining the time and place of the sinking of the Ivanovets based on star positions. Wow, I mean, that's some serious OSINT work, but here we have a potential positioning for that. So not in the lake. There was various reports that it was in the lake or near the lake. Either way, I think the prevailing theory, or at least what I think is the most probable theory, is this ship was being used as a radar, essentially helping the network coverage of radar for air defenses across northern Crimea there. And so therefore the claim that there was no value in the Ukrainians thinking the ship is absolute codswallop as far as I'm concerned. It was offering decent capability to the Russians, was useful to the Russians. That's why it was there. It's not just sitting there as a kind of holiday ship. And it was taken out. A very successful strike. Moving on to other bits and pieces, Ukrainian armed forces cut off Russian missile carrier ships from the logistics base and caliber reserves in Sevastopol. Now, this is something I've talked about before, and it's really interesting to see this explicitly laid out here. So the idea is that we might well have seen fewer caliber cruise missiles being used over the last however many months, because Sevastopol was routinely struck by cruise missiles and drones to the point where they pulled out the Black Sea Fleet and pulled them to Novorossiysk. But the problem is, as I reported previously, apparently the caliber cruise missile loading platforms or loading processes and mechanisms and equipment still at Sevastopol, and it isn't easily transferred to Novorossiysk. And so in Novorossiysk, they don't have the ability to load the naval ships with cruise missiles. And that means that they may well have cruise missiles to fire, they just can't fire them from their naval ships. And we've seen most of the cruise missiles fired from airplanes in the northern areas of Ukraine, or north of Ukraine in Russian territories. And this goes towards this. This was announced by the Speaker of the Ukrainian Navy, Dmitry Platenchuk. Quote, enemy ships are forced to quickly swim to the shores, quickly load one missile, and quickly get out of there. They were cut off from Sevastopol, where the main logistics base is in the Black Sea, where all the infrastructure is, and most importantly, the calibers remained in Sevastopol. End quote. According to the officer, the work of the Russian Black Sea Fleet is very complicated. In Novorossiysk, where the ships were transferred after attacks in the territory of Crimea, the problem with loading missiles has never been resolved. So that's still an issue. That's fascinating. And still missing in action since the 29th of December, we have Valery Gerasimov, the Army General, Chief of Staff, First Deputy Minister of Defense. Where you at now? And also, since the 22nd of September, Viktor Sokolov, the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, the Admiral. Where is he at? If you remember, this guy was supposedly killed in a strike on the naval headquarters in Sevastopol. Lots of Russians sort of denying this. But of course, difficult to deny when he's been missing now for, October, November, December, 4 months. 4 months the Admiral of the Black Sea Fleet has been missing. I think he's dead. And Gerasimov has been missing now for a month. And he is the main man in the armed forces for Russia. So for me, the probability with each passing day higher and higher. I think we're almost at near certainty that the Admiral has been killed, or at least severely wounded. And that Gerasimov, I think we've got a high probability, maybe sort of, I'd say moving on to 65% for me, something like that he's dead or wounded. Probably about 70% plus. So yeah, just this should be something that you know, I wonder why the Ukrainians aren't making claims about this more formally, shouting about this, because I think that's really significant news if true. Okay, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care. Speak soon.